We continue with the New Deal policy of the American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the 1930s. We have discussed his ascent to power, and we have discussed the so-called First New Deal, which aimed at helping America recover from the Great Depression of the late 1920s and early 1930s. Today we look at what was referred to as the Second New Deal. So what were the areas of focus of the Second New Deal? During the second 100 days of his term of office, FDR, or Franklin Roosevelt, developed programs to assist the farmers as they had suffered greatly during the Great Depression because of the fall in prices of their produce. He wanted to provide further relief to those who were suffering as a result of unemployment, food shortages, and a general decline in their welfare. Thirdly, his focus was on the area of increasing jobs, the number of jobs that were available. The fourth area of focus was providing social security, especially for the elderly. And finally, the government looked at the issue of making available utilities that were affordable to people. So utilities are your daily services, like your electricity, running water, your garbage collection services, etc. So what did he do to assist the farmers? Now, the problem mainly with farming in America at that time was that there was a shortage of good quality crops because farmers had become very despondent. In other words, they too had suffered as a result of the Great Depression, and they lost motivation to produce high quality and a greater amount of crops. So Roosevelt took the unusual step of telling farmers to actually decrease their production. Now, this is unusual, you will think, because in a time of need, one would increase production. But there was logic to what he was saying. Firstly, if you decrease production, you push up prices. Now, the pushing up of prices will help the farmers because they'll be motivated to produce more crops at a later stage and better quality crops. But the second reason for cutting production was, if you look at this second point indicated here, he wanted them to stop producing soil depleting crops. Now, what are soil depleting crops? Those crops that deprive the soil of its nourishment because the same crop has been produced in the area year after year. And this fell under a law that was passed known as the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. So he made provision. To allot means to make provision for, to give. So he provided for the farmers in terms of this law. What about soil conservation? Around the world, there is a necessity for us to conserve soil, to save the soil because of wind erosion, because of human abuse of the soil, and various other natural factors. So Roosevelt encouraged farmers to conserve or save the soil using different methods, and in return, he awarded these farmers. So the award could come in the form of machinery, like tractors, or it could come in the form of cash. Thirdly, he provided small loans for sharecroppers to buy land. Now, who were sharecroppers? You may remember this from grade 10 history when we did the Land Act. Sharecroppers are those people who do not pay the landowners rental in the form of money. They pay in the form of their crops. So if they produce, let's say, 50 kilos of tomatoes for the month, they might give 5 kilos to the landowner as rental instead of money. So he decided to encourage these sharecroppers to own land by giving them small loans. So this will motivate the sharecroppers to produce more. What was the additional relief provided during the second New Deal? There was the establishment of the Works Progress Administration. This here shows us the logo of the Work Progress Administration, or the WPA. It was aimed at prosperity. There were several benefits to the Work Progress Administration. It helped the youth, professional people, and other workers. $11 billion was spent to put 8 million people to work. So you can see a significant amount of employment was created as a result of the WPA. Some of the achievements of the WPA: there were 850 airports created. Now that is a massive number of airports. You must understand these are not all large airports. They could be airstrips. There were 651,000 miles of roads and streets, 125,000 public buildings, and women made 300 million garments for the needy. So that was a staggering achievement for the WPA. In terms of labor, Roosevelt's key goal with regard to labor was to make sure that workers' rights were protected, and of course that jobs were created. Now, just to inform you, in America, they spell the word labor as L-A-B-O-R, not O-U-R. So I just corrected that for you there. So to protect workers, one of the things Roosevelt encouraged workers to do was to join a union. Workers' unions are there to protect workers' rights, to prevent them from being retrenched or fired from their jobs for no valid reason, to ensure that they are paid their minimum wages, to ensure that they are not exploited by their employers, and other general working conditions and labor practices should be fair. So one of the things that Roosevelt introduced was what was called the Wagner Act of 1935. And there's a poster related to this. It said, if I went to work in a factory, the first thing I'd do would be to join a union. And this was a poster actually created by Roosevelt. What he was telling workers to do, in effect, was protect yourself from being exploited. Make sure you're part of a labor union, which will have what's called bargaining power, collective bargaining power. Let's assume that the employer of a factory decided that he is going to get his workers to work for 16 out of 24 hours a day. That is unreasonable, and of course, it's unhealthy and unfair. So with collective bargaining, it means if there are thousands of workers that belonged to, let's say, a clothing workers union, they could go on strike as a means of protest to ensure that the workers' rights are protected and they do not have to work these unreasonable hours. It prohibited means it did not allow unfair firings of union members or organizing unions. As another example, assuming a woman fell pregnant and she took leave for a month after her child is born, and the employer decided to fire her, she could challenge this via her union by stating that this was unfair labor practice, and the union could represent her in a hearing with the employer. Then there was the Fair Labor Standards Act, which we'll see in the next slide. Workers were protected in terms of working hours, where they were required to work no more than 44 hours per week. In addition, at that time, in 1935, they would earn 25 cents per hour. This seemed like a very measly sum, but it was reasonable for the time. And very few people were under the age of 16 could work. This was to protect children. There was some unskilled work which was not harmful to children, which was allowed, but it was very, very limited. Looking more specifically at the Wagner Act, it was associated with another law called the Fair Labor Standards Act. In terms of the Fair Labor Standards Act, children were protected. You can see there's protests here. There were demands for 40-hour working week. And you see, not so clearly here, unfortunately, you see here workers being allowed the right to protest. This is Roosevelt signing the bill into action. It was an important law introduced by the National Recovery Administration. It protected the rights of workers and helped to eliminate child labor. Then there was the Social Security Act. As you can see in this image, there's a very distraught looking old man. Obviously, he's burdened by the fact that as a result of the Great Depression, he has no hope. He probably has no family to look after him. He's got no job. He's probably lost all his income. So to protect or to assist the elderly, the disabled, and those who were unemployed, Roosevelt introduced the Social Security Act. This is equivalent to our social security services provided in South Africa. In terms of this law, which was passed in 1935, there was assistance provided to all those who were over 65, or what we call pensioners. Half came from workers and half came from employees. And there were some other benefits. So you would be expected to contribute if you're a worker, and once you turn 65, you would receive Social Security. As far as utilities were concerned, this is an image of power lines being provided. So electricity would be provided throughout the United States. Electricity was expanded throughout the country. In 1935, there were only 12.6% of farms that had electricity, but within a space of 14 years, more than 90% of the country was electrified, or farms were electrified. It also regulated electrical utilities. What this means is that electricity fell under one entity, like we have Eskom in South Africa. Unfortunately, we have Eskom. However, in the United States, they had single utilities in each state which controlled the provision of electricity. For example, in Tennessee, they had the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, which we have discussed already. Right, we've gone through the criticism of the New Deal, but I want to reiterate some of the concerns some Americans had about Roosevelt's New Deal. And this especially came from the Republicans and those who were opposed to the idea that workers' rights should be respected. So while many US citizens applauded Roosevelt's New Deal, his reforms also created controversy. Some called him, we said, a socialist or a communist. And the reason they said that was because they said he was giving too much, the government had too much of power over businesses. They were concerned about this amount of power that the government had over businesses, where unions were encouraged to protect workers' rights and government ensured that workers were not exploited. They believed this would lead to socialism or communism, where the government would control the economy and not businessmen. Roosevelt was also accused of using deficit spending. In other words, he spent more money than was received in taxes to help the country recover from the Great Depression. Some people were opposed to this. Then there were others who believed Roosevelt didn't do enough to help the poor and to reform the economic system enough. Yet others believed he was not radical enough at using government power to end the Great Depression. So this is linked to the third point. This cartoon illustrates the opposition to the New Deal. Here you see a mask showing that the worker or the laborer is very happy. There's this front, so to speak, an image of workers being very happy because of the New Deal. However, the figures here who would largely represent those who are dissatisfied are those who Roosevelt in some way did not appeal to. In other words, they were the ones who were critics of the New Deal. So behind this New Deal policy, you've got a whole lot of dissatisfaction as well. And you would see that the dissatisfaction comes because the opponents believe that the New Deal policy, behind this New Deal policy, there's an intention to introduce communism, collectivism. Collectivism means where communities work together to create a kind of communist society, where there are some individuals who will benefit, self-perpetuating political barons, where there would be a redistribution of wealth, like in a communist society, okay? And there would be utopian dreamers. Utopian means this ideal society would be created, but that would be by a handful. So there were various entities that were dissatisfied with Roosevelt's New Deal. Overall, however, it must be stated that the New Deal was largely successful in helping the United States come out of the Great Depression. So when we assess the New Deal, in other words, we review the successes and failures of the New Deal, you would look at the relief, recovery, and reforms. The positive side was millions of Americans enjoyed some form of help because of the relief agencies like the Federal Emergency Relief Agency, the National Banking Act, etc. There was direct relief or jobs that provided a steady paycheck. The Social Security and unemployment insurance became a long-lasting part of the government. In terms of recovery, it was not as successful at economic recovery. That's the New Deal. Unemployment remained relatively high, although there were many jobs created. It left thousands of roads, railways, dams, and public buildings as works of art. So they were created but not used extensively. In terms of reform, that's long-term change. It was more successful and long-lasting. The FDIC, the the Federal Industrial Recovery, restored public confidence in the nation's banks. And the SEC, both of which the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Industrial Corporation, and the Securities Exchange Act, the SEC, were aimed at protecting investors' monies so that in the event of a similar crash, stock exchange crash or Great Depression, the public's confidence would be restored or maintained in the stock markets. Overall, the New Deal is regarded as having been a success which restored American confidence in the capitalist system and led America once again on the path of prosperity and growth. That concludes the section on the New Deal. We will be looking at the activity based on the New Deal in the next recording.